of President Zelensky. Quote, "The destruction of the dam confirms that Russian forces must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land." But that, of course, is, I would think, fanciful, impossible, even inconceivable if he's including Crimea.
Yeah, I think it was Matthew McConaughey who in a recent film was talking about Fugazi. He was describing people that are trying to predict what happens in the marketplace with stocks and bonds and so forth. He just says it's all Fugazi, Fugazi, Fugazi. Forget it. You can't predict anything. You don't know what's going to happen. Don't worry about it. The point is to move the client's money from his pocket into yours. Well, I think that describes Zelensky brilliantly. Lots of Fugazi, please send more money. None of it's going to work. So it's ridiculous.
Gary, can you run the clip, please, of Secretary of State Blinken? Colonel, this is Secretary of State Blinken last weekend in Helsinki.
As I've made clear, by virtually every measure, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic failure. Yet, while Putin has failed to achieve his aims, he hasn't given up on them. He's convinced that he can simply outlast Ukraine and its supporters, sending more and more Russians to their deaths, inflicting more and more suffering on Ukraine's civilians. He thinks that even if he loses the short game, he can still win the long game. Putin is wrong about this, too. The United States, together with our allies and partners, is firmly committed to supporting Ukraine's defense today, tomorrow, for as long as it takes.
So President Zelensky called President Putin a cornered animal. I would argue that Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin have painted themselves into a corner with this nonsense about as long as it takes. I mean, should a war end by a ceasefire now or a ceasefire a year from now after 100,000 more humans are dead and 100 billion more American dollars have been wasted?
Well, my first inclination is to suggest that Blinken's middle name is Fugazi. But then there's a second point that needs to be made, and that is this inhumanity towards the Ukrainian people. It's inconceivable to me. This is a thing with which I've had a great difficulty from day one. Obviously, nobody gives a damn what happens inside Ukraine to the human beings living there. And that's outrageous nonsense. That is the antithesis of everything we say we represent as Americans. So they should be ashamed of themselves. As far as coming to an conclusion here, look, he talks about outlasting. Putin thinks he can outlast us. Judge, he's already done that. Take a long, good look at Germany. Germany is sliding into a very deep recession, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Cheap energy is the lifeblood of scientific industrial power and economies. Germany is being industrialized by their own leadership. Just yesterday, I watched a speech that Scholz arrived to give. He couldn't give it. He was booed off the stage. And people yelled at him and screamed at him. He kept saying, "We are fighting Putin. We have to fight Putin." And people just said, "Nonsense. Boo. Forget it." The Germans never believed that the so-called Russians were coming. Nobody in Europe, in Western Europe, believed that. This is nonsense that we've spun out of it. I go back again. If you're going to say that the Russians were incompetent and incapable, then how can they simultaneously be bent on conquering Eastern Europe and Central Europe? It's a lot of nonsense. The whole game is almost up in the West. And I think Germany will be the bellwether. At first, I thought it would be France, but now I'm beginning to think it'll be Germany. I don't see how this Scholz government can last.
Is the West tiring of the war?
Oh, absolutely.
Except for the Biden administration.
Well, I don't think that this is an enormous burden for anybody sitting in the U.S. Senate. I mean, I don't see them losing any sleep over how many people die in Ukraine or how much money is wasted on this proposition. But then again, we just saw them sign up for another enormous debt ceiling. and continue to pretend that debt doesn't matter. I think we all know that's going to end badly for the United States and the West. So these are just irresponsible human beings in charge in Washington. The question is what we Americans are going to do when the whole thing implodes. And I think it's coming.
How significant in World War II was what was set in motion on June 6, 1944, D-Day?
Well, Americans are routinely treated to these horrific numbers, and they are horrific, involving Soviet losses during the Second War. When I was in Moscow in 2001 at the General Staff Academy, the historian there briefed me personally, because I asked him, and told me that they had counted 39,900,000 dead, including more than 15 million Soviet soldiers. And he said, we're still counting. The Russians have since changed their numbers. They moved them to 26 million. I think they've now moved it up to 32 million. The truth is it was at least 39 million dead. And we're presented this as evidence for victory. Well, that's not what sealed Germany's fate, contrary to popular belief. We provided something under the so-called Lend-Lease program, thanks to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that provided enormous quantities of equipment. And if you put that slide up, Americans can see this. This is from Albert Week's book, Russia's Lifesaver, Lend-Lease. And look at all the materiel that we provided. Railroad equipment, trucks, wheeled transport. When the Germans were fighting the Soviets in Stalingrad in November of 1942, they found all of the Soviet troops riding on American wheeled trucks and jeeps. And when the Soviets made films of Stalingrad, they cut out every photograph that showed anything from the United States.
Colonel, did we sell this? Did we lend it, or did we give it to the Soviets?
FDR gifted everything, which in today's numbers would be hundreds of billions of dollars. The Soviets were never asked to repay a dime.
You say FDR. You didn't say the Congress.
No, FDR acted on his own. There was no bill passed at the time authorizing FDR to ship anything he wanted to the Soviet Union. In fact, in 1941, in July, the first meeting was held in Moscow with Stalin by Harry Hopkins. And when that meeting was held, it was held by Harry Hopkins only. The U.S. ambassador and the U.S. defense attaché were excluded from the meeting. And during that meeting, the entire Lend-Lease program was set up, and Stalin provided a list of what he needed. For instance, you saw on that chart, petroleum. We shipped so much petroleum, that is oil, to Russia during the Second World War that the Russians actually resold great quantities of it to the Japanese, against whom we were fighting.
Boy, how did we get petroleum from the North Atlantic to Russia during World War II?
Well, it actually went across the Pacific under Russian flag. And because it was under Russian flag, the Japanese didn't sink it. So it was delivered largely to Vladivostok. See, this is the bizarre history of the Second World War. And, you know, we helped the British as well, and we charged them for everything. And they were effectively bankrupted by the Second World War. And FDR wanted to do that because he was determined to destroy the British Empire. He actually said that he thought the British Empire was evil, but that Stalin's state was not.
Oh, my goodness. I guess he never said that to his second cousin, Winston Churchill.
Well, Churchill wasn't much help.
No.
Because Churchill never objected, and Churchill ran his country into the ground. I think a whole new story about the Second World War needs to reach the public. They need to know what the truth is. My only statement, the reason I'm concerned about this, Stalin begged us repeatedly to attack in the West. He wanted us to attract 80 divisions of the German armed forces to fight in the West. When we landed at Normandy, the Germans had 40 divisions there, and eventually it rose to higher numbers, 60, 70 divisions. Of course, they were all grossly under strength. Instead of 12,000 or 13,000, there were only 5,000 Germans in these divisions. But nevertheless, the Normandy invasion was critical to the Soviets because once we came ashore, we did draw off most of the best forces that were readily available to fight the Soviets in Poland.
Right.
And your historians will remember that in June of 1944, and on the 22nd, the Soviets attacked in Operation Bagration. And that attack reached all the way to Warsaw and effectively liberated all of White Russia and took them into the Baltic Littoral and right up to the Carpathian Mountains. In other words, it advanced Soviet national interests, but it didn't help us at Normandy, but we certainly helped them. And we haven't even talked about the bombing campaign. We lost 18,000 heavy bombers, we in the Royal Air Force, penetrating German air defenses. And those bombers did something for the Soviets that no one else could have done. We destroyed the petroleum industry in Germany. We stopped the shipment of oil. By the time the Russians attacked in June of 1944, the average German aircraft had about 2 hours of flight time with fuel, after which it crashed. So one can argue about who won the war. The point that needs to be kept in mind is without us, without our bombing campaign, I don't think the Soviets would have ever reached Minsk in White Russia.